Welcome my friends, this is Maniacal Incorporated, and today I'm going to take a look at the rise of the Dalgash, their greatest king Brian Boru, and, spoiler alert, his death at the Battle of Clontarf. These events fall between the major start dates in Crusader Kings 2 and 3, so they don't feature much in either game. However, they will greatly influence the course of Irish history and impact the topic of the next video, so I'm going to cover them here. By the early 10th century, Munster was dominated by branches of the Onocht, most notably the Onocht Cashel, and they ruled over minor branches of their own dynasty, and smaller vassal or subject groups unrelated to them. One of these was the Deis Thuaisceart, who held lands in the southeast of what is now County Clare. Following the death in battle of their king, Cormac mac Cuilleann, in 908, the Onocht were thrown into a period of political instability, and in this, the Deis Thuaisceart must have seen an opportunity. They rebranded themselves as the Dalgash, the share or division of Cass, and conjured up a genealogy tracing their descent from Cormac Cass, who they claimed was a brother of the mythological founder of the Onocht. From this, the tiny vassal dynasty would claim a right to rule the entire province of Munster. In 934, Lorcan mac Leachna, the chief of a minor branch of the family, became king of the Dalgash. This may have been a violent seizure of power, as one of his sons killed the son of his predecessor, Rebeccaun mac Mohala, the same year. Lorcan's ambitious eldest son Kinetic, who succeeded him in 942, was determined to seize the kingship of Munster for the Dalgash, and led armies beyond their dynastic lands for the first time. Seeking out alliances, he had his daughter Orla married off to the High King of Ireland, Donogh Donn, of the southern Inéal. While Kinetic may have joined forces with Donogh to attack Munster in 940, the following year Orla was accused of committing adultery with the High King's son and executed. Had she been of a more prominent family, she would most likely have been banished back to them in disgrace. While the Dalgash were on the way up, they were still regarded by the ruling powers as irrelevant. Kinetic expanded beyond the ancient lands of his dynasty, and is described in the annals as king of a new political entity, Tuathuin, North Munster, later anglicised as Thomond. He would pay a heavy price for his success, however. Threatened by the growth of the Dalgash, the king of Munster, Ceallachain Cashel, inflicted a heavy defeat on them in 944, in which two of Kinetic's sons were killed, and the new High King of Ireland, Congal Crova, invaded in 950, resulting in the death of another two of his sons. Kinetic himself died the following year, possibly slain by the Vikings of Limerick. Succession between generations under the system of tanistry could often lead to instability and infighting. Kinetic was succeeded by his son Leachna, but he was dead within just 2 years, murdered by a minor branch of the family. Kinetic's next son, Mothgamoin or Mahoon, was able to retain power and was in a perfect position to benefit from the disintegration of the Onocht, which kicked off in 954 with the death of Ceallachain. 3 of the next 4 kings of Munster would die violent deaths, including Ceallachain's son Donogh, who was murdered by his brother in 963. While the kingship may have lain vacant after Donogh's death, the strongest candidate, Moel Mud mac Bran of the Onocht Rahaland, joined forces with Ivor, the Viking ruler of Limerick, and marched against the Dalgash in 967. At the Battle of Sulfoid, Mahoon crushed the alliance and sacked Limerick shortly afterwards. Following another defeat in 969, Moel Mud gave hostages to Mahoon, a sign of submission. The goal, which had claimed the lives of his father, 5 brothers and a sister, had finally been realised. With no serious power to stand against them, a member of the Dalgash was now recognised as King of Munster. Though the Dalgash would use their falsified genealogy in a bid to claim legitimacy, the Onocht considered them to be usurpers and bided their time until they could retake power. In 972, Moel Mud attended a conference of nobles convened by Mahoon, but in 974 he broke out in open revolt, and others soon turned on the Dalgash in a bid to restore the old order. In 976, Mahoon was betrayed by Donabhain mac Chahal, the head of a minor family loyal to the Onocht. From the way the event is referenced in the annals, it would appear that the men met for talks under guarantees of safety, but Donabhain seized the king and turned him over to his ally, Moel Mud. While he could have forced Mahoon to give him hostages, thus becoming his overlord, he instead decided to make an example of this insignificant dynasty that had dared challenge the might of the Onocht. Mahoon was executed. With 6 of Kintig's 11 sons dead and the family on the back foot following the Onocht restoration, dynastic infighting, or a weak successor at this stage, could have been the end of the Dalgash. Instead, rule fell to one of Kintig's youngest sons, Brian, and within a year he burst forth from Tuathuin, bent on avenging his brother's death. In his first 2 engagements, his forces killed Ivar of Limerick, 3 of his sons, and Donavon, the man who had betrayed his brother. In 978, he met with Moel Mud at the Battle of Balaclachta and inflicted a devastating defeat onto the Onocht, which crippled them as a threat for the remainder of his rule. Among the dead was Moel Mud. While his predecessors had thought only of the Kingship of Munster, Brian was now in a position to extend his power beyond its borders. In 982, Brian led a failed invasion of Ossory, which drew the attention of the new High King of Ireland, Moel Shocknail MacDonald. Having occupied Dublin after defeating the armies of Umleaf Corone 2 years prior, he now invaded Munster to make sure that Brian knew his place. His forces sacked the lands of the Dalgash and desecrated their inauguration site, but to little effect. Brian invaded Ossory again in 983, capturing and forcing the submission of its king, and he possibly also received the submission of members of the Dunlena in northern Leinster. It was common to establish alliances through marriage in such circumstances, and it was around this time that Brian married Gormla, the daughter of a former king of Leinster. She had previously been married to Umleaf Corone until his death in 981. For the next decade, Brian consolidated his power and carried out raids, which weren't always successful, into Connacht and Meath. Through his mother Bevan, he was related to the Ivruan Shola, the kings of Ir Connacht, and by either utilising these ties or forcing his will on them, warriors from Connacht would play an ever larger role in his armies. By 997, Moel Shocknail was forced to recognise the new political reality that Brian had created, and the 2 men held a royal conference to divide the island between them. Moel Shocknail would have hegemony over Le Queen, Con's half, while Brian would be superior in Le Moga, the southern half of the island named for Mug Nuada, an ancestor of the Onocht. In effect, Moel Shocknail, who came from a long line of high kings, was recognising Brian as his equal. Things had changed dramatically since his grandfather Donacadon had executed Brian's sister. The new alliance got off to a great start. In 998 they paid a joint visit to Dublin to obtain hostages from its new king, Sitric Silkenbeard, who was also Brian's stepson through his marriage to Gormla. As it was historically part of the province of Leinster, which put it in Le Moga, the settlement became part of Brian's sphere of influence, while Connacht returned to Moel Shocknail. Though the Norse of Dublin had long converted to Christianity, married into Irish families and adopted many aspects of Irish culture, they were still referred to as foreigners by the annals. They had benefited from disunity amongst the Irish. Sitric's father Amlív had almost seized Tara itself, and Sitric resented the new political dynamic on the island. He didn't have far to look for allies. In 999, Sitric and his uncle, Brian's brother-in-law, Moel Morda MacMurcha, captured and deposed the King of Leinster. Worried that this was the prelude to a full-blown rebellion, Brian marched on Dublin in the depth of winter and faced off against the joint Norse-Leinster alliance at the Battle of Glen Mauma on the 30th of December. Though losses were heavy on both sides, it was a resounding victory for Brian, after which he entered Dublin on New Year's Day, the 1st of January 1000. Gold, silver and slaves were taken back to Munster, and part of the settlement was burned. Sitric had fled after the battle, but negotiated a return to Dublin by submitting to Brian and pledging military service to him, and to strengthen this new alliance, he married his stepsister, Brian's daughter Sloania. It was inevitable that the agreement between Brian and Moel Shocknail would break down at some stage. The Inéal had been severely weakened by internal conflict, and the High King had put forward the compromise mainly to buy time, hoping that he could either gather support from the northern Inéal or that Brian would overreach and come crashing back down to earth. Instead, Moel Shocknail remained isolated, while Brian now controlled all of the Norse trading settlements on the island, along with their fleets and warriors. Brian also had little intention of allowing his ambition to be curtailed, and shortly after his victory at Glen Mauma, he invaded Meath and marched towards Tara, the ancient symbolic capital of Ireland. Moel Shocknail appears to have been in no position to offer battle, and the northern Enail refused to join him. Brian eventually withdrew back to Munster, and while the annals are silent on the matter, it seems likely that some compromise was reached, or that possibly Moel Shocknail submitted to him. The following year, Moel Shocknail and the King of Connacht, Cahal Mac Cruthúr, attempted to blockade the Shannon, which Brian depended on to move troops north. He responded by attacking Athlone, and is recorded in the annals as taking the hostages of Connacht and Meath. The implications are clear. Brian was now the direct overlord of all bar the very northern provinces. He was now the High King of Ireland. The northern Enail, however, led by the Kennel Owen, resisted Brian's attempts to gain their submission. They claimed kingship over modern-day Ulster, but were unable to stop Brian from taking the hostages of Ulla in 1003. To reassert dominance of the region, the Kennel Owen attacked Ulla, but in a devastating slaughter, the kings on both sides were killed. Brian took advantage of the political chaos this caused, and in 1005, with the royalty of Ireland, he set out on a great tour. His entourage, with a massive army in tow, spent a night at Tara and then travelled north to Armagh, the ecclesiastical capital of the Enail, where their greatest kings were buried. There, in the Book of Armagh, he was addressed as Imperator Scotorum, the Emperor of the Gael. While it may have been little more than a term of flattery bestowed on a man who had a rather large army standing behind his back, there are hints that Brian's power extended beyond the island of Ireland. As overlord of all of the Norse holdings, he would also have been the nominal overlord of any of their vassals, such as in the Isles. It's possible that, in search of powerful allies, Scottish rulers submitted to Brian. The ruler of Mar in southeastern Scotland would die fighting in his armies during the Battle of Clontarf. Regardless, the need to find such lofty titles for Brian showed that he had achieved more than any king before him. Over the next few years, Brian would make numerous attempts to subdue the northern Enail. In 1010, he gained the submission of the Kennel Owen, and their king, Flaherty Cúnail, married one of his daughters. In 1011, his eldest son and intended successor, Murcha, led the armies that captured the king of the Kennel Connell and forced his submission. Brian, the scion of an insignificant dynasty, had now achieved what no high king before him had ever done: the submission of every major power on the island of Ireland. But kingship in medieval Ireland was highly precarious. At the height of his power, ruling over the entire island, Brian's great weakness was that he could only rely on the loyalty of the men of Munster and maybe some of his kin in Connacht. The rest of his vassals he ruled through military might alone. The northern Enail resented his usurpation of the high kingship and the continued rule of Moel Shocknail as king of Tara. In 1013, Flaherty raided Meath and the Kennel Connell attacked Connacht. As Brian's rule began to collapse, Sitric and Moel Morda joined forces again. They defeated an army of Moel Shocknail sent to oppose them and raided into Munster, possibly landing at Cork by sea. Brian responded by sending an army to ravage Leinster, but had to abandon a siege of Dublin during the winter and returned home. The scene was now set for a cataclysmic showdown. In spring, Brian raised his army again and marched on Dublin, while Sitric called in allies from throughout the Norse world. Perhaps surprisingly, there is no contemporary account of the battle that occurred, though the annals give a lengthy list of the dead. Cogga Gael Ré Gallav, a biased and self-serving history of the wars between the Irish and the Vikings, commissioned a century later by Brian's descendants, is the first to even mention its date or location. Brian and those allies that had remained loyal to him, mainly Moel Shocknail and the king of Ivonia, Dáibhí Calig, began to raid around the settlement of Dublin as Norse warriors arrived there during Holy Week of 1014. By now, in his mid-70s, Brian set up a camp from where the operation was overseen. His eldest son Murcha was given command of the main army, while his younger son Donnacha was sent to raid into Leinster. Remembering what had happened to the settlement after Glen Mauma, Sihtric remained inside the walls of Dublin while the joint Norse-Leinster forces, under Brian's brother-in-law Moel Morda, moved north towards Clontarf. Here they assembled with foreign reinforcements led by Sigurd of Orkney and Broder of Man, and on Good Friday, the 23rd of April 1014, they met Murcha's forces in the greatest battle yet fought on Irish soil. Conflicting accounts of the engagement are given in Icelandic sagas, Welsh annals, and French commentaries. All agree, however, that it was a bloodbath. The Cugga says that the men were so coated in blood that they couldn't recognise their own sons or brothers, except by voice, and their weapons were clogged with hair ripped from the heads of their enemies. Having started at sunrise, the battle went on into the evening, and the Viking assault may have collapsed in disorder when they realised that the tide had come in and cut off access to their boats. Some desperately tried to secure them, but they were pursued into the water and slaughtered. Of the 6,000 or so men who had arrayed against the High King's army, only a few hundred who fled towards a nearby wood survived. Moel Morda mac Murcha, Sihtric's brother Dovgol, and Sigurd of Orkney were dead and their armies crushed. The victors didn't come off much better, however. Murcha and his 15-year-old son Thorluk had also been killed, along with the King of Evonia and numerous important Munster nobles. Though they held the field, they were in no position to attack Dublin itself. But the worst was yet to come. As he fled the battle in disarray, Broder of Man came upon a tent where he found the High King praying and killed him. The 13th century Icelandic Níl saga says that those who captured Broder cut open his belly and tied his entrails to a tree, which they forced him to walk around until he had disemboweled himself. With the High King and many of his most likely successors dead, the political alliances Brian had formed collapsed. As per his wishes, his body was taken to Armagh to be interred with those who had ruled before him, but the High Kingship now most likely reverted to Moel Shocknail. His son Donnacha was left to lead his broken army back to Munster. He seems to have been able to hold on to power there, and after Moel Shocknail's death in 1022, he was able to retake the High Kingship. But Brian's ascent had forever changed the face of Irish politics. He had broken the stranglehold of the Ínail and had shown that no matter how small a dynasty they belonged to, anyone who was prepared to flood the country in blood could dream of becoming High King. Many after him would try. As I mentioned earlier, the events of this episode fall between the current start dates of Crusader Kings 3, and all of those involved are dead by 1066. Starting there, we can take a look at the Dalgash family tree and see that Paradox have implemented the genealogy that connects them back to Cormac Cass. While his supposed brother Owen is also in the game, they haven't been connected, possibly because this would make the Dalgash eligible for succession to Owen titles in the 867 start. As they don't impact the game, few of Brian's brothers are depicted as having children, but we know that a number of modern surnames descend from his father Kinetic. As well as the O'Briens, these include the MacMahons and the Kennedys, a minor branch of which, in conjunction with the Normans, would briefly seize power in the United States almost a millennia later. Historically, the Kingship of Leinster rotated between three branches of the Dunlena dynasty, but Paradox has left them out of CK2 and CK3 and instead represent the Íchinsealig, excluded from power for over 300 years, as the province's rulers. In fairness, trying to populate all of the houses of the Dunlena would probably be a nightmare. Because of their prominence in Irish history and their relationship to important characters, a few members of one of those houses, the Ífuelón, are present in the 1066 start. Murcha and his son Moel Morda are there, but his son Bran, a later king of Leinster, is missing. He'll feature briefly in the next episode. Moel Morda's details state that he was 82 years of age when he died, but as he is said to have taken an active part in the Battle of Clontarf, this seems improbable. He has likely been mistaken for an ancestor of the same name, and was actually about 30 years younger. And last but not least, there is Gormla and some of her children, including Sihtric, the King of Dublin, and Donnacha, who she would live to see become King of Munster and High King of Ireland. But awkwardly flanking Donnacha are four supposed sons by Moel Shocknail MacDonald. Some accounts claim that after the death of Amlív in 981, she was first married off to Moel Shocknail and then to Brian after he took the High Kingship. But those accounts are disputed, and we know that Moel Shocknail was married to a daughter of hers from her first marriage, which may have caused the confusion. Modern historians no longer believe that Gormla was ever married to Moel Shocknail. There's a lot that I haven't been able to cover here, such as Brian's nickname, Brian Boru, Brian of the Cattle Tributes, supposedly given to him for the massive payments his vassals made to him, or for the eye-watering taxes he levied on the trade along the Shannon. The Irish word borova does indeed mean cattle tribute, but in this context it means Brian from Borova, a reference to a great ring fort associated with the Dalgash. This is one of the many legends connected to Brian which are expertly dealt with in Seán Duffy's Brian Boru and the Battle of Clontarf, published to coincide with the battle's 1000th anniversary. I use a number of books as sources for these episodes on Irish history, referenced in the description below, but for this episode I was heavily dependent on Duffy's work. If you're interested in a deeper understanding of Brian Boru, Clontarf, or medieval Ireland in general, I would greatly recommend this book. It was written for a general audience and is very accessible regardless of how new you are to the study of Irish history. Cogha Gael Regalov would later paint Brian Boru's victory and death at the Battle of Clontarf as saving Ireland from the terror of pagan Vikings. But we've seen that the Norse had largely integrated into Irish society and fought on both sides that day, those of Limerick serving alongside Mordcha. It was instead a dramatic conclusion to the life of a man who had risen from nothing to become the most powerful Irish ruler of all time, and the first to bring all of Ireland under his personal rule. It would be wrong to say that he united Ireland, however, as shown by how quick many were to throw off his rule, but given time and stability, he and his successors could have changed that. I'll look at the immediate consequences of the Battle of Clontarf in the next episode on the 1066 start in Crusader Kings 3, focusing on Brian's Munster successors. If you've enjoyed this episode, please give it a like, and if you haven't done so already, check out my playthrough starting in 867, where I send all my heirs to die in battle, justify my actions by referencing medieval Irish texts, and then go off on a tangent about the meaning and pronunciation of obscure names. Thank you for joining me on this episode, and I hope to see you again in future.